Good evening. My name is Jeff Bradshaw, and on behalf of the Interpreter Foundation, Book of Mormon Central, and Fair Latter-day Saints, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to each of you. This virtual fireside is the first of 6 events. Tonight, we commemorate the anniversary of the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. Beginning October 18th and continuing through November 22nd, we'll be hosting similar firesides honoring selected events and teachings from the final years of Joseph Smith's life, roughly correlated with corresponding lessons in the Come Follow Me curriculum. Online links for each fireside will be available a few weeks prior to each presentation on www.interpreterfoundation.org. Within a few days after the fireside, a new permanent link for each fireside will be made available to allow later viewing. For more in-depth study on each of these topics, a book will be published in early 2022. The theme of this fireside series, A Life Lived in Crescendo, comes from an observation made by Elder B.H. Roberts in the Introduction to the Prophet's multi-volume documentary history. Joseph Smith lived his life in crescendo. It grew in intensity and volume as he approached its close. Higher and still higher, the inspiration of God directed his thoughts. Bolder were his conceptions, and clearer his expositions of them. So far was he from being a fallen prophet in the closing months of his career, as apostates charged, that he grew stronger with each passing day. He preserved, amid all the conflicts and trials through which he passed, the natural sweetness of his nature, the intellectual playfulness characteristic of him from his boyhood. Our opening prayer will be given by Liz Addams. Following the prayer, Gene's presentation will be introduced by Richard E. Turley, Jr. Before his retirement, Brother Turley served as an assistant church historian and later as managing director of the church's public affairs department. Following Gene's presentation, a closing prayer will be offered by Tom Norris. Time will be set aside for viewer questions following the fireside. To submit questions, please email conference-questions@interpreterfoundation.org or send a text message to 208-991-0315. That's conference-questions@interpreterfoundation.org or send a text message to 208-991-0315. Now for our opening prayer by Liz Addams.
This evening's virtual fireside will be delivered by R. Gene Addams and is titled True to the End, the Culmination of the Ministry of Joseph Smith at His Martyrdom. R. Gene Addams is a lifetime church history enthusiast, independent historian, and author. He and his wife, Liz, reside in Woodinville, Washington. He recently completed his 20th year as a volunteer Institute of Religion instructor. He holds a BS in accounting and an MBA from the University of Utah and is happily retired. He has presented and published several articles dealing with the redemption of Zion and the Church of Christ Temple Lot. His most recent articles include Zion's Printing and Publishing Company, From the Redemption of Zion to Corporation, published in the Journal of Mormon History in April of 2020, The Return of the LDS Church, 1900 to 1907 to Jackson County and the Redemption of Zion, published in the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal in the Fall-Winter 2018 issue. The History and Acquisition of the Original Temple Lot Property in Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, published in Mormon Historical Studies in spring of 2019. And A Contest for Sacred Space, The Ancient Order of Things, Essays on the Mormon Temple, Signature Books 2019. He is the author of Upon the Temple Lot, The Church of Christ's Quest to Build the House of the Lord, John Whitmer Books 2010. And in 2021, he published The Past and the Future of the Temple Lot in Jackson County, Missouri, as a chapter in the book, The Temple, Past, Present, and Future. Gene is a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association and a member of the Mormon History Association, the Sons of the Utah Pioneers, and the Missouri Mormon Frontier Foundation. His interests, besides family, include fishing and skiing. Throughout his life, the prophet Joseph Smith experienced intense persecution. In the squalor of Liberty Jail during the winter of 1838 and 1839, he received the comforting assurance from the Lord that his days were known and his years would not be numbered less. However, when he reached Nauvoo and went well into his ministry there, he began to have premonitions of his forthcoming death. And for that reason, he began to accelerate some of the plans that he had for revealing doctrine to the church and its members.
Today, Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob while incarcerated in Carthage jail on trumped-up charges. Today, we commemorate his death and martyrdom and that of his brother Hyrum. As noted by Rick Turley in his generous introduction, after the 1838-1839 experience in Liberty Jail, the prophet Joseph became more aware that his mortal days were numbered, that he would have not many years left to guide and direct the church. My appreciation to Ronald Esplin for his insightful research on this part of the project. In April 1842, speaking at a Relief Society meeting in Nauvoo, he said that he did not know that he would have many opportunities of teaching them, as they were going to be left to themselves. They would not long have him to instruct them. He spoke of delivering the keys of the priesthood to the church, for according to his prayers, God had appointed him elsewhere. Later that same month, in April of 1842, Joseph preached at the funeral of Ephraim Marks and said, "Some have supposed that Brother Joseph could not die, but this is a mistake. It is true, there have been times when I've had the promise of my life to accomplish such and such things. I have not at present any lease on my life. I am liable to die as any other man." John Taylor, apostle and editor, recollected in December of 1843, quote, "In his anxiety and for fear that he would not live to see the temple completed, he prepared a place over what was known as the Red Brick Store, where, to a chosen few, he administered those ordinances that we now have today, and that if anything should happen to him, which he evidently contemplated, he would feel that he had fulfilled his mission." And then in June 17, 1844, 10 days before the martyrdom, Joseph Smith addressed the Nauvoo Legion. He said at that time, "I do not regard my own life. I am ready to be offered a sacrifice for this people. Greater love hath no man than he should lay down his life for his friends. You have stood by me in the hour of trouble, and I am willing to sacrifice my life for your preservation." Let us now shift to the events leading to the martyrdom at Carthage. After the saints were driven out of Missouri in the winter of 1838-1839, they went east to the state of Illinois, where they were generally welcomed. From Quincy and surrounds, they eventually worked their way upriver to a little town called Commerce, which was renamed Nauvoo, and within a short period of about 4 years had made Nauvoo the second largest city in the state of Illinois. And with that came political power, growth, and politics. Hancock County became a hotbed for politics, where Nauvoo was located, as both parties vied for the votes of the saints, who generally voted as a bloc. Another point, Joseph Smith's position of authority in Nauvoo and the Nauvoo Charter, which provided its own court system, became another sticking point. Joseph was, of course, the prophet and the president of the church, but he was also the mayor of Nauvoo, and he was lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, a large body of some 3,000 plus men, a fully authorized military militia of the state of Illinois. And so we have all the ingredients of the jealousy of Missouri all over again. And then, to top that off, Joseph announced his presidency for candidacy for the President of the United States in 1844. The reason was simple. None of the known candidates would take a position favorable to the plight of the saints over their problems experienced in Missouri. So the Quorum of the 12 were sent on missions to the eastern states to proselytize and to campaign for the president, Joseph Smith. That only left John Taylor and Willard Richards behind in Nauvoo. And so with that, we then throw in apostasy and disaffection. Sidney Rigdon and William Law, the first and second counselors in the first presidency of the church. Sidney Rigdon, unhappy, out of sorts with Joseph and others, and mutual, had left Nauvoo and gone to Pennsylvania. And second counselor, William Law, had been dropped from the first presidency in January 1844 and excommunicated in April 1844, when it was found that he was in league with the other dissidents. Rockwell, in fact, Orrin Porter Rockwell, had advised Joseph Smith after his escape from jail in Missouri in December of 1843 that there was, in fact, a Judas in our midst, something he'd picked up while he was in Missouri. Well, the perceived reasons for this dissent was that Smith was too powerful, and along with that was disagreement over new doctrines, such as baptism for the dead, not announced, but plural marriage, and the endowments for some and anticipated for all with the completion of the temple. However, the destruction of the printing press of the Nauvoo Expositor was the single culminating event that brought about the prophet's eventual removal to Carthage. The Expositor, a newspaper dedicated to exposing the prophet and others, organized by the apostates, the Law brothers, the Foster brothers, the Higbee brothers, and others. Announced on May the 10th, 1844, its first and only issue was June the 7th, 1844. The reaction to the newspaper was powerful within the Nauvoo community and around about, resulting in a meeting of the City Council of Nauvoo 3 days later on June the 10th. The paper was declared a public nuisance. An order to destroy the press was signed immediately thereafter by the mayor. Remember, that's Joseph Smith. And the press and type were ordered destroyed by the city marshal, which was carried out that very evening. Reaction throughout the state was outrage. Freedom of the press was the cry. Calls for mob violence and expulsion of the Mormons. One of the leaders in that movement was Thomas Sharp, editor of the Warsaw Signal. Well, Joseph and Hyrum and others were arrested on the charge of riot. There was no riot on June the 12th. And because of their Nauvoo charter, they were able to go and appear before the Nauvoo court, where they were released. This action further infuriated the anti-Mormons of Western Illinois, especially Thomas Sharp, as I mentioned, editor of the Warsaw Signal. Mass meetings were held in Carthage and in Warsaw, calling for, quote, extermination of the Mormons. Well, it wasn't long until Governor Thomas Ford became personally involved. He arrived in Carthage on the morning of Friday, June the 21st, to take personal charge of the situation. and he immediately sent a letter to Joseph Smith as mayor and to the city council in Nauvoo. He requested that one or two persons who were well acquainted with the situation to immediately come to Carthage and explain to the governor their side of the story. John Taylor and J.M. Bernheisel were so chosen, both well acquainted with the situation, and immediately left for Carthage to explain to the governor exactly what had taken place. Well, they arrived late. The next day they give the report after many delays. They're treated with contempt. They finally get their response. They leave in the late afternoon to go back to Nauvoo with the governor's latest demand, that Joseph and Hyrum come immediately to Carthage and answer the charges which have been made against them. They are accompanied on their return trip to Nauvoo with Captain Yates and a company of mounted militia, who are authorized to escort Joseph Smith and the others back to Carthage. And he also carries the governor's order. On the night of June the 22nd, a meeting of certain church leaders and others is held in Dr. Bernheisel's room at the mansion house in Nauvoo, following the return of John Taylor and Bernheisel. Captain Yates first delivers his demand and then leaves. Afterwards, Taylor and Bernheisel gave their report and reported specifically the dissatisfaction they experienced with the meeting and the conduct and the companions of those around the governor. To which Joseph Smith responded with these words, "There is no mercy here." Hyrum added, "Just as sure as we fall into their hands, we are dead men." Other options were discussed. The meeting lasted late. And then at a certain point, Joseph stopped the others and said, "The way is open." He summoned Orrin Porter Rockwell and asked if he could return after midnight to facilitate the departure of both he and Hyrum from Nauvoo. Certainly Joseph's decision to leave Nauvoo and to cross the river into Iowa territory, where he could at least be out of the jurisdiction of Illinois while he had a chance to think over his options. In doing so, he remarked to Stephen Markham, "I told Stephen Markham that if I and Hyrum were ever taken again, we should be massacred, or I was not a prophet of God. I want Hyrum to live to avenge my blood, but he is determined not to leave me." On the early morning of June 23rd, Sunday, Orrin Porter Rockwell, Rose, Joseph, Hyrum, and Willard Richards across the Mississippi River to Iowa. Turns out the boat that Rockwell borrows had a leak, and the three men were busily involved using their boots to build water as they crossed the river to get to the other side. Anyhow, they arrive about 5 a.m. in the morning. Joseph immediately sends a letter back to Emma, which is a plan for her and the children to depart Nauvoo, and Hyrum likewise does the same for his family. Throughout the morning, and then throughout the part of the day, he counsels with Richards and others that have gathered on the Montrose side. Options are explored. Historically, the discussion has been focused on an escape to the west and was no doubt considered. However, Iowa and further west was not a safe place for the Smiths either. Recent research by historian John W. Welch indicates that the options certainly included Joseph lining up legal counsel in Iowa to defend himself and Hyrum for the following week in Carthage, Illinois, in the matter of the original warrant that was issued for their arrest, that being the destruction of the Expositor and the charge of riot. This map shown here is helpful in indicating the locations of the various towns in our discussion. Messengers were sent to well-known attorneys in eastern Iowa with the request to facilitate legal representation in their behalf, Joseph, Hyrum, and the others. Also was discussed the possibility of going east and meeting with U.S. President John Tyler. That same morning, June the 23rd, Emma met with brothers Sherwood and Cutler. They had been assured by Captain Yates, who had stayed over the night before, that Joseph would be protected, both on the way and while there in Carthage. She asked them to go and persuade Joseph to return. Otherwise, and I quote Emma here, Nauvoo would be burnt up and the people massacred. Meanwhile, Emma receives Joseph's letter, and she sends for Wasson, Kimball, and Cahoon. They have a discussion, and she asks them to go across the river and persuade Joseph to give himself up and come back to Nauvoo. So once again, Orrin Porter Rockwell rows across the river to the Iowa side with the three men, as requested by Emma. They arrive about noon on Sunday. Joseph is informed that he is being accused of cowardice by several in Nauvoo, and he remarks at this time, a well-known quote, "If my life is of no value to my friends, it is of none to myself." He turns to his dear friend Rockwell and says, "What shall I do?" And Rockwell responds by saying, "You are the oldest and ought to know best." So Joseph then turned to Hyrum and said, "You are the oldest. What shall we do?" Hyrum responded, "The Lord is in it. If we live or have to die, we will be reconciled to our fate." Joseph said then, "We had better go back, and if we die, we will die like men." So the party returns down to the Mississippi River. Joseph and Orrin Porter lag behind. The others urge them to hurry up. Joseph replies, "It is of no use to hurry, for we are going to be slaughtered." So back to the mansion house. No doubt a very restless night, for on the morning of June the 24th, they depart for Carthage. Joseph, Hyrum, and others assemble in front of the mansion house. A crowd has also assembled to send them off on this journey of deep concern. There are family departures, goodbyes. Quoting, "After embracing his little children, who were clinging to his clothes, and after bidding a tender farewell to his wife, whom he loved greatly, also in tears, and after giving the last comfort to his aged, saintly mother, he addressed the entire crowd with great effect, exhorting them to be faithful in the way and with the religion which he had taught them." While doing so, Joseph's sons pulled on his clothing and cried, "Father, oh Father, don't go to Carthage. They will kill you." His mother then asked if he could promise that he would return. And not answering her directly, he again addresses the assembled saints. Quote, "If I do not go to Carthage, the result will be the destruction of the city and its inhabitants. I cannot think of my dear brothers and sisters and their children suffering the scenes of Missouri again in Nauvoo. No, it is better for your brother Joseph to die for his brothers and sisters, for I am willing to die for them. My work is finished." We return to the map we looked at previously to quickly orient ourselves to where Carthage is located, about 20 miles from Nauvoo. Joseph and Hyrum make their departure, accompanied by the other men who have been charged with destroying the press and causing the riot, and a group of devoted men who are also willing to go to Carthage to provide safety for the prophet and his brother. Interestingly, Orrin Porter Rockwell, assumed to be his bodyguard and a lifetime friend, was told specifically not to go and was given another assignment. They leave, up the hill they go, and pause as they approach the Nauvoo temple, then under construction. And Joseph says, as he looked on the sacred edifice and then on the city, and remarked, "This is the loveliest place and the best people under the heavens. Little do they know the trials that await them." And so it is that they're on the road to Carthage. Some 6 or 7 miles from Carthage, the Smiths party stops at the Fellows farm and are met by a company of horsemen under the command of Captain Dunn, coming from Carthage. Joseph is told by Dunn that he has been ordered by the governor to secure the return of all arms issued by the state to the Nauvoo Legion. Joseph Smith dictates at this point in time 2 letters and then sends Brother Sherwood back to Nauvoo to begin the process of collecting the state-issued arms before he makes the departure. At this point, Joseph became reflective and made the oft-quoted statement to those around him that we hear of, and his recital closely parallels that recorded by John Taylor in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 135. "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am as calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward all men. If they take my life, I shall die an innocent man, and my blood shall cry from the ground for revenge. And it shall be yet said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." And so it is that Joseph and party return to Nauvoo on the same road they've just taken, and the state arms are in fact collected. They're back at the mansion house again for another round of tearful goodbyes with family and friends, and then back on the road to Carthage. They arrive late at night, around midnight. Lodging was obtained at the Hamilton House, the same place that the governor is staying. They had been in the saddle about 50 miles of riding that day. Wow. And so the next morning, they certainly can see nearby the Carthage jail. And the next 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, become very occupied. First of all, though, a little background. Several units of the state militia have been ordered to duty by the governor and are now in Carthage. The Carthage Greys, a very loud, outspoken anti-Mormon group, remain in Carthage after these other units are dismissed. And during these 2 days, various legal and illegal maneuvers, hearings, meetings, inappropriate and unjustly high bail amounts are set, appeals, etc. Joseph is represented by the 2 attorneys from Iowa that had been arranged for the previous Sunday. Joseph Bentley has written and discussed this matter in detail, and I certainly appreciate his input. The destruction of the press and the riot charges were the original issues, but they have run their course. A new scheme is quickly concocted to incarcerate the Smith brothers when those ruses to jail Joseph and Hyrum were not working. This was all part of a preconceived plot to get the Smiths into jail, where the conspirators could accomplish their nefarious plot to kill Joseph Smith. So it is that Joseph and Hyrum are again arrested on Tuesday. This time they are charged on the sworn statement of avowed enemies. The charge is treason. Joseph, according to the governor, had declared martial law when it appeared Nauvoo was in danger of an attack and was considered in excess of his duties as the mayor and the general of the legion. The problem is there's no bail for treason. And Joseph and Hyrum are later that day ordered to jail in spite of the fact that the minimus signed by Justice of the Peace, Robert F. Smith, who just happens to also be captain of the Carthage Greys and an avowed anti-Mormon, stated in the minimus that a hearing had in fact been held, which had never occurred. Robert Smith was obviously in league with the other co-conspirators. Well, the jailer put them in the debtor's room, not the barred cell. There were a large number of men that went with Joseph and stayed through the night. They went to the room at the top of the stairs. Appeals were made, but to no avail. Governor Ford offers weak excuses as to why he would not intervene. The governor, after much prodding, meets with the Smiths and others in the jail in the late morning of Wednesday the 26th. The conclusion of that meeting, Ford promised to take Joseph with him tomorrow when he is planning to go to Nauvoo. Well, throughout the day, messages and messengers come back and forth. The illegality of their arrest and imprisonment are challenged again, but to no avail. Additional legal counsel in Illinois is sought, but with no success. There is tension in the air. The militia mob mill around. Threats are made to the messengers coming and going to meet with the prophet. Hostility is evident everywhere. And so the setting for the last night, Wednesday night, Thursday morning. After an exhausting day on Wednesday, the remaining party of 6 men prepare to sleep the night in the upper room of the jail. Joseph and Hyrum took the one bed. John Taylor, Willard Richards, Dan Jones, and John Fulmer bed down on the floor. Later, a gunshot is heard, and Joseph gets up and lays down on the floor with the others, and Willard Richards takes the open side of the bed. And when all is quiet, Joseph whispers to Dan Jones, "Are you afraid to die?" Dan Jones replies, "Has that time come, think ye? Engaged in such a cause, I do not think death would have many terrors." Joseph responds and tells him prophetically, "You will see whales and fulfill the mission appointed to you ere you die." And Dan Jones, in fact, does return to his native land and becomes one of the greatest missionaries of all time. Well, it's Thursday morning, the setting for an assassination. Jones and Fulmer are sent on errands and deliver their messages, but they're not allowed to return. Joseph writes his last 2 letters, one to Emma and one to Orrin Porter Rockwell. Rockwell's letter implicitly tells him not to come and do not let yourself be arrested. The governor leaves in the morning for Nauvoo and does not take Joseph as promised. The Carthage Greys are left on duty to guard the jail. There are no more visitors. A feeling of foreboding is prevalent. So now we're going to shift to the rescue attempts on June the 27th, 1844. First, Samuel Smith, the prophet's younger brother. Samuel lived in Plymouth, about 40 miles from Nauvoo, and it was only that morning that word reaches Samuel that his brothers are being held in a jail at Carthage. He departs almost immediately with a 14-year-old lad who was working for him at the time. They left with a team and wagon for Carthage, which is about 16 miles away. Nearing Carthage, they were stopped by men stationed to block people from going any further. Samuel is identified, warned, threatened. The boy is allowed to continue, but not Samuel. And in the heat and humidity of that late June afternoon, Samuel jogged home. He immediately took his workhorse and traded it for a racehorse with a neighbor. Shaken and haggard, he again bade farewell to his family and raced to Carthage. Nearing Carthage, he was again identified, and a chase through the woods takes place. And we'll leave him there and shift to the second effort by Orrin Porter Rockwell. Governor Ford's entourage had reached Nauvoo and held a secret council in the mansion house in the afternoon of June the 27th. Rockwell, having left his hat in the room from the day or two before, innocently goes to the mansion house to retrieve the hat, and unaware, walks in on the meeting held by Ford. He overhears someone say, as he reaches for his hat, "The deed is done by now." There was no immediate impact of that statement to Rockwell. He took his hat and left. The full impact of that remark registers later, after Governor Ford had lectured the citizens of Nauvoo and departed for Carthage, late in the afternoon of June the 27th. Later that night in his room, he ponders the events of the day and recalls the remark made earlier and the silence that followed after that remark as he exited the meeting that he had happened upon. He and a brother, Gilbert Belknap, immediately mount up and race towards Carthage. It is late at night. And we will leave him there and return to the afternoon of the 27th. The jailer has suggested that Joseph and the others go into the cell. Joseph replies that they'll do so after supper. And at that point, he turns to Willard Richards, apostle and secretary, and says to Richards, "Brother Richards, if we go into that cell, will you go with us?" The doctor answered, "Brother Joseph, you did not ask me to cross the river with you. You did not ask me to go to Carthage with you. You did not ask me to come to jail with you. And do you think I would forsake you now? But I will tell you what I will do. If you are condemned to be hung for treason, I will be hung in your stead, and you shall go free." "You cannot," Joseph said. "I will," replied the doctor. It's now about 4 o'clock. John Taylor sings "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief." After he's finished singing it, he's asked to sing again. And as he completes the song for the second time, it's about 5:10 p.m. and the jail is stormed by a mob of over 100 men with painted faces. The Carthage Greys put up a mock resistance, fire blanks over the heads of the oncoming mob. Immediately, they rush the jail and ascend the stairs. An attempt to block the door is made by the prisoners. The mob fires through and around the door and through the windows from the outside. A shower of bullets fills the room. Taylor described the barrage of balls and bullets as being as thick as your arm. Hyrum Smith is shot in the face and killed. As he fell to the floor, he simply exclaimed, "I am a dead man." Joseph paused only but for a second and said, "Oh, my dear poor brother Hyrum. Almost simultaneously, John Taylor was shot 4 times and fell to the floor. Joseph, in an attempt to draw the firing away from the wounded Taylor and the unscathed Willard Richards, leaps to the window. He was shot twice in the back from inside and twice from the breast and the shoulder from men shooting from the outside. Joseph fell through the window to the ground below, landing near the well. His last words as he fell through the window were simply, "O Lord, my God." The mobbers rushed down the stairs to be certain that Smith is dead. Willard Richards was miraculously unscathed. He was a large man, weighing over 300 pounds. In the midst of the shower of bullets and balls that filled the room, he escaped without a scratch, except for a graze on the lower tip of his left ear. His life was spared, and a prophecy Joseph had made to him over a year previous was literally fulfilled. At that time, he told Willard that the time would come that the balls would fly around him like hail, and he should see his friends fall on the right and on the left, but there should not be a hole in his garment. Richards hurriedly dragged John Taylor into the cell, covered him with a straw mattress from the bed, and said, "This is a hard case to lay you on the floor, but if your wounds are not fatal, I want you to live to tell the story." The mobbers return and ascend the stairs, presumably to be sure that the others are dead. They obviously would want no witnesses. No sooner had the returning mobbers reached the top of the stairs than they heard the shout, "The Mormons are coming!" The shout was from William Hamilton, teenage son of the innkeeper, whom had been posted as a lookout. William had heard a cannon roar and mistook the loud discharge as an indication that the feared retaliation force of Mormons from Nauvoo was indeed ascending on Carthage. Actually, the roar from this prepositioned cannon out on the prairie was a signal to the conspirators, including the Governor Ford party then in Nauvoo, that the deed was done. The mob retreated back down the stairs and dispersed or left town, as did most of the residents of Carthage. At this point in time, Willard Richards exited the jail. He was, of course, concerned about a return of the mob, not realizing that they were all departing. Now we are to the aftermath of this tragedy. It's the evening and night of June the 27th. Samuel Smith, you recall, was left riding through the woods, being chased by the mob. He arrived in Carthage after the harrowing ordeal, but alas, too late. Somewhere between 6 and 6:30, his brothers have been killed. Understandably, he is overcome and in great distress and physically exhausted. He works his way to the Hamilton house, where, with Willard Richards, they arranged that evening, with the additional persuasion of William Hamilton and the senior Hamilton, to move Taylor to the inn. Medical help is also made available for Taylor. And assistance from the Hamilton family is provided to retrieve and secure the bodies of Joseph and Hyrum. Caskets are made that night by Artois. About 8 p.m., Willard Richards and John Taylor, who barely can sign his name, sent a message to the locals in Nauvoo, and they use a couple of couriers, local men, that is Carthage men. The message was for the citizens to remain calm, but the couriers Fearing retaliation by those in Nauvoo, handed off the note to others, who in turn stay off the main road, take a roundabout way, and the result of their careful journey was that the message arrives the next morning in Nauvoo, but after the word of the assassination had already been communicated, as we shall see. Earlier that evening, George D. Grant and Constable Dennis Bettisworth had heard about the shooting in the Carthage jail and the murder of the Smith brothers, shortly after the event had transpired. Grant lived only about 3 miles from Carthage. The two men left immediately for Nauvoo. En route, they were met by Governor Ford and his party and their guard about 3 or 4 miles outside of Nauvoo. The Ford party had heard the cannon and immediately had departed from Nauvoo for Carthage. Grant and Bettisworth are, quote, compelled to go back to Carthage with Ford. The governor feared for his life should the inhabitants of Nauvoo hear of the murders and immediately react in a retaliatory manner before he and his party can be safely back in Carthage. Well, it's between 11 p.m. and midnight when the party does get back to Carthage. Ford then meets, regardless of the late hour, with Taylor, Richards, and Samuel Smith. The reality of the retaliation is of the utmost concern. Another message is prepared, this time by Taylor and Richards and Samuel Smith. Ford also signs the message with a personal notation, as did General Deming, Hancock County Militia. Jointly, they urge defense if necessary, but not retaliation. George D. Grant is now charged by Ford to go straight to Nauvoo in haste. He is dispatched around midnight. And so it is, on his way to Nauvoo, that he meets up with Rockwell and Belknap, who have left and are heading towards Carthage. They're not far from Carthage when they meet, and Grant is being chased by horsemen from Carthage, who apparently hadn't got the word that he was on an official errand for the governor. Grant blurts out the news of Joseph's death. Rockwell and Belknap dismount, take cover. The mob charged at a full gallop and opened fire. Mistake. Rockwell and Belknap return fire, and one by one, Rockwell picks off the horsemen. The mobbers retreat. Grant, Rockwell, and Belknap now travel on to Nauvoo with the official message. In the early hours of Friday, June the 28th, Anson Call, on guard duty at the temple, met Rockwell, who shouted as he hurried by to spread the word. Joseph is killed. Joseph is killed. They have killed him. They have killed him. Well, the next morning, Willard Richards, Samuel Smith, and Hamilton bring the bodies to Nauvoo in wagons provided by the senior Hamilton. Willard Richards and Samuel Smith drive one wagon, Artois drives the other. An assigned guard accompanies the wagons. And I pause here to comment. If it had not been for the Hamiltons, the aftermath would certainly have been more difficult and perhaps different. And the martyrs may well have numbered 3 or 4. John Taylor, critically injured, remained at the inn for several more days. Well, it's an emotional scene with the families of Joseph and Hyrum as the caskets are delivered to the mansion house. As a side note, Emma was pregnant. Her son David Hyrum, was born November 18. The bodies are prepared for burial almost immediately. It's hot and humid in June in Nauvoo, always. Willard Richards then calls the citizens of the Nauvoo together that afternoon. About 8,000 gather, and he preaches to them on the importance of keeping the peace and announces that the viewing at the Mansion House will be scheduled for the next day, June the 29th. The crowd that came through the viewing was estimated at 10,000. The funeral service was held that evening at the stand or assembly place right after the viewing. W. Phelps was asked to preach the sermon and did so. The bodies of Joseph and Hyrum were buried secretly in graves in the basement of the unfinished Nauvoo house. The coffins had sandbags secretly placed when the bodies were removed, and the coffins then were buried in public view following the funeral. A couple of side notes. Samuel Smith, sick from exhaustion and with a pain in his side, and possibly suffering from the early stages of pneumonia, was housed in Nauvoo following the funeral. He died a month later, on July 30. His wife was pregnant. A baby girl was born a month later. Mother Lucy Smith buried 4 sons in a period of 3+ years: Don Carlos, Joseph, Hyrum, and now Samuel. Some final thoughts. At the April Conference in 1844, Elder King Follett's funeral was preached as part of the General Conference setting, at which point in his remarks, Joseph Smith made this pronounced statement, powerful, impactful. You don't know me. You never knew my heart. No man knows my history. I cannot tell it. I shall never undertake it. I don't blame anyone for not believing my history. If I had not experienced what I have, I would not have believed it myself. I cannot lie down until my work is finished. When I am called by the trump of the archangel and weighed in the balance, you will all know me then. Many are the tributes spoken in honor of the memory of Joseph Smith, but perhaps the greatest is that composed by hymn maker W. Phelps, Praise to the Man. Now this song is oft sung, and I, for one, enjoy the singing of it. But sometimes the full impact of the words can have a different feeling when they're just read by themselves. And so it is that I'd like to do that now. Praise to the man who communed with Jehovah. Jesus anointed that prophet and seer, blessed to open the last dispensation. Kings shall extol him, and nations revere. Praise to his memory. He died as a martyr. Honored and blessed be his ever great name. Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, stain Illinois while the earth lauds his fame. Those were the original words and were not changed until 1927. Great is his glory and endless his priesthood. Ever and ever the keys he will hold. Faithful and true, he will enter his kingdom, crowned in the midst of the prophets of old. Sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven. Earth must atone for the blood of that man. Wake up the world for the conflict of justice. Now picture this statement in the 1844 time in which it was said. Millions shall know Brother Joseph again. Hail to the prophet, ascended to heaven. Traitors and tyrants now fight him in vain. Mingling with gods, he can plan for his brethren. Death cannot conquer the hero again. In conclusion, I refer to the Doctrine and Covenants, section 135. He lived great and he died great in the eyes of God and his people. And like most of the Lord's anointed in ancient times, has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood. And so has his brother Hyrum. In life, they were not divided. In death, they were not separated. They lived for glory, they died for glory, and glory is their reward. It has been a great honor to have been asked to present this fireside. I have a great feeling of love and respect for the memory of the prophet Joseph Smith. Thank you. Closing prayer will be by Tom Norris.
Our Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this day and for the many blessings that we enjoy. We're especially grateful for Brother Addams and this platform on which to hear about the history of our beloved prophet and the events leading up to his death. We pray that the Spirit that has been with us tonight can work with us and help us to understand the importance of these events and how that can strengthen our knowledge and understanding about the sacred mission that was his to restore the gospel and to bring forth the Book of Mormon in the latter days. We're grateful for all those who have prepared in delivering this fireside and this message, and ask that the Spirit would be with them as we depart tonight. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Gene, we have a few questions for you here in a minute. Thank you very much for that beautiful message and testimony. Here's our first question. What do you think Joseph Smith meant when he said, "The way is open," announcing his decision to return to Nauvoo, even though he seems to have known that he would be killed there?
There's much controversy and discussion on that. And as I indicated, that historically, the thought has been that they were to go to the Rocky Mountains. But as we also pointed out, with research recently done on that subject, that maybe just being outside of the jurisdiction of the Illinois authorities would give him the opportunity to clearly think through whatever options were there available for him. And that certainly is the way it turned out. That's my thought on the subject.
Thank you, Gene. Another question, why were the Smiths buried secretly?
Well, there had been talk amongst a lot of the dissidents, among the anti-Mormon element that was up and down the western Missouri, that they would desecrate the graves. And they were just concerned that that not take place, and so that's why they were buried secretly.
Thank you. How much responsibility do you think Governor Thomas Ford bears for the assassination of Joseph and Hyrum Smith?
Well, I think Governor Ford, in spite of what he says, in an effort to kind of cover himself, definitely violated his promise in terms of taking Joseph back to Nauvoo with him. I don't think he ever intended to do that anyhow, but I think he bears a lot of responsibility. And the other one was who?
That was it, Governor Thomas Ford. what his responsibility was. The final question is, what do the circumstances of the martyrdom of Joseph Smith reveal about his character and his calling?
Well, that's a deep question. I think the fact that as a prophet of God, he certainly knew, with the introduction comments that I provided here, that his time was short, and particularly that comment that he made to Markham about that that he was not a prophet of God if he wasn't right in terms of what was going to happen to him. Then I think being able to stand up to it, and Hyrum as well. I mean, they both made statements about the fact of returning, and it'll be what it'll be. They were willing to sacrifice and give their life for the saints. They certainly didn't want the destruction of Nauvoo and a repeat of Missouri. And as Joseph said, no greater love hath any man than to lay down his life for his friend. I think that says a great deal about both him personally and about his prophetic role as well.
Thank you, Gene. It's been a wonderful evening, and thanks to each of the viewers for being here tonight. We remind you that the next virtual fireside in this series will take place on October 18th, and we'll be talking about the Freemasonry and the origins of temple ordinances in Nauvoo. Thank you each for being here, and we hope to see you at a future fireside. Good night.